Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. The Trump administration has proposed a controversial 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, outlining a framework that could see Kyiv cede Crimea and the Donbass, limit its military and forego NATO membership, while Russia would be reintegrated into global economic structures. With European leaders seeking to be part of negotiations and concerns growing over EU cohesion and security, Andreas Umland from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs joins us to unpack what this plan could mean for Europe, Ukraine, and regional security. Andreas, welcome back to TVP World. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me again.
Pleasure. So your takeaways, your main takeaways from these 28 points?
It would make sense if it had come from Russia. The problem with this peace plan is that it is seemingly also coming from the United States. And I would say it's in direct violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that was signed in connection with Ukraine's agreement to get rid of all of its nuclear weapons. The United States was back then very interested that Ukraine gets rid of its nuclear weapons because the intercontinental missiles on Ukrainian territories were directed on the US. And that's why the US then pressured Ukraine to not only get rid of its intercontinental missiles, but of all nuclear material, all nuclear warheads, and also all delivery systems that were handed over to, most of them were handed over to Russia. And then this memorandum was signed, and now the US is not following the memorandum anymore. In this memorandum, it says that the US respects Ukrainian territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and this peace plan is clearly an expression of disrespect for Ukrainian sovereignty and integrity. And it's, I think, a scandalous document. And it means now that 3 out of the 5 nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and 3 out of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Russia, the US, and also China, are violating in one way or another. Most of it, of course, comes from Russia, but also China and the US in their ways, the Charter of the United Nations and the obligations that the US and both, or the respect that both the US and China have expressed in 1994 for the borders and the territorial integrity and national sovereignty of Ukraine.
Okay, so thanks for laying that out. That's very clear. But the question then becomes, well, why is Trump doing this? He seems to be swinging one way or the other, but most of the time he seems to be in the Russian camp. What's going on?
That's a good question. It would be better to ask perhaps somebody in Washington about this. I guess there are 3 possible ways why it's playing out this way. But there is simply a pro-Russian faction in the White House that is sometimes having more influence, sometimes less. And then Trump follows it, or follows also maybe the more pro-Ukrainian people around him. There are also some of them. Then it's simply about one other hypothesis. It's simply about Trump, that he has his own preferences and that he changes his mind, he's probably also already not fully aware of what's going on around him due to his age, something like that. And then the third old speculation is that Russia may have something on him. So-called compromising material with which it is pressuring Trump. The whole, for me, the most interesting thing here is that while Trump is very ambivalent towards Ukraine and often appears as pro-Russian, most of the Americans are, as far as I read the opinion polls, are pro-Ukrainian, and they see the conflict as it is, and they are critical of Russia and especially of Putin. But Trump is actually contradicting American public opinion and even what seems to be the majority view among Republicans. That is at least my impression from the opinion polls. And therefore, this is a strange behavior, not only because of it, because it is so inconsistent, but also because it contradicts American public opinion.
Indeed, and that may well be the reason for the tension, the tension between the public opinion and relationship with Russia might well be the reason for Trump's ambivalence and refusal to pick a side and stand by it firmly. Now, the European leaders have been quite diplomatic, I would say, by saying, well, this is a good starting point, but it needs a bit of work. I think that's a bit a gentle way, perhaps, a gentle response to it. What do you think the EU strategy is towards this?
I guess both the EU and Ukraine, they have learned over the last year to handle Trump. And we had these swings. We had the meeting in Anchorage between Trump and Putin. And then we had a very different meeting of the representatives of the EU in the White House in Washington. Or we had these strange negotiations around the minerals deal, where the US came with one draft of the minerals deal, which was scandalous, almost neo-colonial. But then negotiations started, and a totally different text of this mineral deal came out. I guess that is now also the hope of Ukraine, that even though the starting document that is now on the table looks very bad indeed, it almost looks like a Russian wish list, or at least parts of it. And other parts are simply bizarre, when Russia and the US are saying that Ukraine should become an EU member and should have special access to the European market. Neither of them is a member of the EU, so it's not quite clear why they are taking a position on that, or the very first point of the peace plan, that Ukraine is a sovereign country. It's almost, I think it has a psychological meaning in that that even such a phrase occurs. So the hope is, I guess, both on the EU's and the Ukrainian side, that this is merely the beginning of a conversation, and that perhaps something at the end may come out that can be acceptable for Ukraine.
It seems to me, Andreas, that there's a lot of activity on the EU side, on the Ukrainian side, on the US side, but very little indeed from Russia, getting involved in the conversation and coming forward with constructive proposals. Do you think this is simply another time-wasting exercise on Russia's behalf?
Yeah, in our center in Stockholm, we have one of my colleagues has introduced this concept of negotiation theater. So what is happening is not actually negotiations; it's just a theater play that is made for Trump, for the international community, for the many supporters that Russia has around the world, for the people who are critical of Ukraine's insistence on its national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And something is to be fed to these various groups around the world. And therefore, this negotiation theater is happening without actually any intention from Russia to bring it to a constructive end.
Right, so there's negotiation theatre going on. What do you think might happen then if the proposal is completely rejected by the EU and or Ukraine? What can Trump do, and what can the EU do to mitigate whatever action he takes?
Well, the fear is now that since we have already this obvious ignorance in Washington about a very, very good deal for Washington in 1994 for the whole American people, because, as I said, these intercontinental ballistic missiles that Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union were directed at the US and could have destroyed many US cities, and Ukraine agreed then to get rid of them. So this deal is now forgotten, and the fear is now that Trump may go even further and actually will pressure Zelensky and will perhaps even sanction Ukraine and will exert the influence that he has on Ukraine to agree to these Russian conditions that are largely laid out in this so-called peace plan.
Well, what should the European Union's response be if that scenario were to come into play?
That will be a difficult situation because in some regards, Europe and Ukraine are indeed dependent on the United States. That's also a mistake, I would say, from the side of both the European Union and Ukraine to be in this dependence from the US that concerns above all the information from the security services, from the satellites that so far is still being transferred from the US to Ukraine. But the fear is that Trump may even go as far as not allowing the Europeans to buy any more American weapons for Ukraine. Namely, those weapons that currently the Europeans at least cannot, and Ukraine cannot build themselves. And that would be then a very odd situation if, so to say, Trump would even go against the interests of American companies in pressuring Ukraine.
What about the impact on NATO of the United States attitude? So, for example, if Russia believes it has a free hand and it starts to conduct some kind of warfare against NATO countries, does Trump have any justification for staying out of that, or do you think he'll abide by those commitments at least?
Yes, I guess that's the question that's emerging. If the Budapest Memorandum doesn't mean anything, or the 2008 strategic partnership that is also a signed document between the US and Ukraine, a bilateral agreement, if that doesn't mean anymore, maybe the Washington Treaty from 1949 also doesn't mean much anymore. And then Russia could understand this American behavior as an encouragement to try perhaps to rebuild the Soviet Union, not only in Ukraine, but also, let's say, in the Baltic region. So that is yet another aspect of this whole peace plan, destructive aspect that is also very concerning. And that is perhaps now also leading both the Europeans and also Ukraine to try to negotiate this peace plan and to basically get rid of the various absurd and scandalous, I would say, demands in there.
Understood. So a very precarious situation. We will be watching it closely. Andreas Umland, thank you very much indeed, as always, for your excellent analysis for our audience. Have a good evening, sir.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. World news coming right up. Bye for now.